All right. So we are starting with the synapse today, and we're looking at our first objective, which is understanding the difference between a chemical and an electrical synapse. So there are two types of synapse. One we will focus on more than the others, but we do want to describe the two general types. So first of all, what is a synapse? So a synapse is a functional connection between one neuron and another cell that is being signaled. Now, the other cell that's being signaled can be another neuron. So it can be a neuron to a neuron. This can be within the central nervous system, but then we can also think about other excitable cells such as muscle or glands that I've been speaking about. And this type of neuron to muscle or neuron to gland connection happens outside of the central nervous system, so the peripheral nervous system. And this is often called a neuromuscular junction, okay? So anytime we have one neuron synapsing somewhere else, that is called a synapse. That somewhere else can be another neuron, or that somewhere else can be a muscle cell, a glandular cell, etc. Okay. Now, if one neuron is signaling another neuron, the first neuron in the series is called the presynaptic neuron. The second neuron in the series is called the postsynaptic neuron. And based upon that understanding, we can have the presynaptic neuron synapsing onto different spots or different regions of that postsynaptic neuron. It can synapse onto the dendrite. That's going to be an axodendritic synapse. It can synapse onto the soma or cell body. That is going to be an axosomatic synapse. Or it can synapse onto the axon of that second neuron, that postsynaptic neuron, and that would be an axonic type of synapse, okay? Now, the most common type of synapse, sort of the traditional synapse that we will speak about, is the axodendritic synapse, okay? And so the other two types are not as common throughout our physiology, not common throughout our nervous system, but we will look at an example of the axonic synapse as we speak about presynaptic facilitation at the very end of this chapter. So basic take home is that the axodendritic is the most common type. This is the one that we'll speak a lot about, but we will also look at a very specific example of the axonic as well, all right? And so the most common one is where the axon of the presynaptic neuron synapses onto the dendrites of the postsynaptic neuron. Now, most synapses are occurring in terms of the direction of that transmission of information is happening in a unidirectional fashion, so one direction. So from presynaptic to postsynaptic, although there's some very rare examples of where we have bidirectional transfer of information from synapses as well, okay? And we'll talk about those coming up. So there are two types of synapses on that, two broad categories. We've got electrical synapses, and then we've got chemical synapses. Now, I want to further describe the importance of a synapse. It's basically the transmission of that electrical energy. So essentially, we spoke about the action potential kind of leading up to this conversation, and we said that the action potential is electrical activity. It is a jolt of electrical energy that is used as a means of communication, right? A signaling mechanism between neurons and other cells. And so when we get to the length, we get down to the end of the axon, this is where the action potential stops. And it will actually be converted into chemical energy for chemical synapses, or it will remain as electrical energy and be transmitted from one neuron to another cell or neuron. And so the different types of synapses just describe the mode of that transfer of energy, whether it remains as electrical energy or is transferred to chemical energy and then transferred to the postsynaptic neuron. So just again, basically going over this information here, we said a synapse is a functional region of communication between one neuron and either another neuron or one neuron and some type of excitable cell, that being a smooth muscle cell, a cardiac muscle cell, or a glandular tissue. And then there are two broad types, electrical synapses and chemical synapses, okay? And we can see an example of those two broad types here. Electrical synapses go right through the cell membrane. These are the rare examples that I talked about where we can see bidirectional flow, right? We can have electrical information going through this gap junction in one direction and then back into the adjacent cell in the other direction. Whereas the more abundant type of synapse, the more common type of synapse, the most important type of synapse is the chemical synapse, and this is always happening in one direction. So we're always transferring information from one presynaptic neuron to the adjacent postsynaptic neuron in one or a unidirectional fashion. So let's spend some time here speaking about electrical synapses, and we're not going to say very much about them. They're not very well understood. They're not very prevalent throughout our physiology. And so this is kind of all that we will say about electrical synapses in terms of differentiating them from the more important, more functional chemical synapse. Yes, someone is asking here in the chat, electrical is bidirectional and chemical is unidirectional. Yes, that is true. Yeah, okay. So electrical synapses are basically two neurons that are linked together by these gap junctions. And these gap junctions are these passageways of communication that allow relation to happen from one neuron to another. So as we can see here, it's basically these connexin proteins that are linked together to form this passageway or pore that allows for the passage of this electrical information or this electrical signal. They function pretty much throughout the nervous system. They are rapid in terms of very fast in their communication. And this is really because of this idea that the mode of communication remains electrical. So we'll see that in chemical synapses, we have to turn that electrical energy, which is the action potential, into chemical energy, and then we have to turn it back into electrical energy. And that takes some time. That kind of slows down chemical synapses. For electrical synapses, because it remains as electrical signals, it is faster, it's a more rapid mode of communication. So we have ions or second messengers that are involved in terms of transmitting these signals from one cell to another. And then, as we kind of reiterated before, the flow of communication is usually bidirectional. In other words, these electrical signals in the presence of ions and second messengers can go through from this cell to that cell, and they can go in the opposite direction from this cell back to that cell, okay? They can be excitation and inhibition, so they can either stimulate the cell or inhibit the cell, in other words, depolarize or hyperpolarize the cell, depending on the type of ions and the types of second messengers that are being relayed or transferred from one cell to the other. Now, again, this is not well understood. In fact, we didn't really understand electrical synapses until very recently. And they were thought to not exist at all, but we have identified them in parts of the retina, parts of the cortex, parts of the brainstem, especially the centers for breathing, the respiratory centers, and then parts of the hypothalamus as well. In fact, they're really only localized in the developing brain. So in some of these regions, but in the developing brain. And then what we kind of understand is that they kind of disappear and are transferred into more of chemical synapses as we age and as the brain develops. So they're really only important in the rapid growth and rapid development of the very young, the very infantile, very fetal brain. Okay. Let's talk about the more important chemical synapse. So chemical synapses are much more prevalent, much more important, much more abundant throughout the body. And again, this is an area of functional communication between a presynaptic neuron and a postsynaptic neuron, always happening in one direction. So from presynaptic to postsynaptic. There's an area or region of a synaptic cleft. So because we have one neuron synapsing onto another neuron, and they aren't flush together the way that we see here with the electrical, let's go back here, electrical synapse, they're not flushed together like this with a passageway or a pore. We now have this cleft that's about 30 to 50 nanometers wide, which is called the synapse, right? That junction or cleft where this communication has to jump across this gap between these two cells, these two neurons. Now, usually we have the axodendritic type of synapse. So basically the axon of one neuron. So here's our presynaptic neuron. Here's our postsynaptic neuron. And so this would be an example of an axodendritic synapse where the axon terminal meets against the dendrites of the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, and so that's going to be the most important, the most prevalent type of chemical synaptic communication. But we do have some other examples, and just to illustrate them here, we have axonic synapses where both axons synapse onto each other. Again, the presynaptic always giving information to the postsynaptic, so that unidirectional fashion. This is an example, we'll talk about an example of this later on. So remember this type of synapse. And then the other rare example is the axosomatic, where we have the axon terminal of the presynaptic neuron meeting or communicating to the soma or cell body of that postsynaptic neuron. Okay. There is another very rare example of dendrodendritic, where we have the dendrites of one synapse synapsing on to the dendrites of another, the dendrites of one neuron synapsing on to the dendrites of the postsynaptic neuron. And that is even more rare and just kind of, not very often, not seen very often in our physiology. All right, so I'll pause here and see what questions we have so far. We've described the basic difference between our chemical and electrical synapses in terms of the rate of transmission, so electrical being more rapid transmission, in terms of the mode of communication, so electrical maintaining that form of electrical energy, whereas chemical is going to transfer that electrical energy to chemical energy. And then the actual mode of communication, electrical being bidirectional, whereas chemical is unidirectional. All right, so let's kind of illustrate that here, just to give us some more clarity and really highlight this. Okay, so we're looking at the synapse. We described it as being a functional connection between a neuron and another cell that is being signaled. Okay, or another cell that it is signaling. And so we describe two main types, chemical versus electrical. All right, and just to highlight some of those main differences here, for easy reference when you're kind of studying this, we said that this was a slower rate, whereas this was a rapid rate. Okay, this was unidirectional. This is usually bidirectional. Oops. Bidirectional. And then here we're going to transfer to chemical energy. And I'll talk about what that means, but in brackets, I'm going to put neurotransmitter, which are the chemicals that help with that chemical energy. And then here it remains as electrical impulses or electrical energy. Okay, so some of the main differences sort of at a glance between these two types of synapses. Let's now illustrate what this synapse looks like. So drawing our neuron here, we've got our soma, right? We've got our dendrites here, okay? And then we've got our axon, oops, a little clumsy there. We've got our axon, and then our axon terminal, okay? And so the axon terminal of this presynaptic neuron. So let's label this out. Actually, let's label this as the axon here, the axon terminal. And so this is going to be our presynaptic neuron. Okay. And then our second neuron, or our postsynaptic neuron, the area that is being signaled for the most common type of synapse are the dendrites of the neighboring neuron. Okay. So here are our dendrites of our postsynaptic neuron. And then here's the axon and axon terminal of our adjacent neuron. Okay. So this is our postsynaptic neuron. But we also described that a synapse can also happen or exist between a neuron and another type of cell. So this is only one type of synapse. Let's actually highlight this here. So this is a neuron to neuron synapse. But by definition, we can also have a neuron synapsing onto another type of cell. Okay, and so that would be a different type of junction here. So we have our axon terminal synapsing onto some type of cell. All right, and the examples that we mentioned were excitable cells such as cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glands. Okay. We can also put adipose here. We'll talk about an example of adipose coming up. Adipose or fat tissue is another rare example of another cell that can be signaled by a neuron. Alrighty. And so
I have a small question.
Yep, sure.
So neurons exist in the brain, right? How are they able to connect to other cells if they exist in the brain?
That's
are there more than just neurons in the brain?
Yep, so that's an excellent question. So there are neurons that exist within the central nervous system. And then this type of communication happens in the peripheral nervous system. So think about your somatic muscles, your somatic neurons innervating your muscles. We're going to talk about the autonomic nervous system. So we do see this type of communication out in the peripheral nervous system, okay, which is not in the brain or spinal cord. So actually, let's finish this up and then we'll draw that distinction or division. But that is an excellent question. So thank you for raising that. So yeah, we were talking about this type of junction. Now this can be either called the neuromuscular junction, if it is skeletal muscle, all right, or the neuroeffector junction. We'll talk all about this in more detail coming up. The neuroeffector junction for all the other types of cells. So specifically, if it is skeletal muscle, actually put skeletal muscle here as well. It's going to be called the neuromuscular junction, but if it is cardiac muscle, if it is smooth muscle, if it is glandular tissue, if it is adipose, it's going to be called the neuroeffector junction, okay? Oops. Sorry, didn't mean to do that. Okay. Let's look at the distinction between central and peripheral nervous system. So as someone very nicely just pointed out, The neuron-to-neuron synapses exist within the brain and spinal cord. That is where we have the central nervous system, okay? So anytime we have a neuron synapsing to another neuron, this is happening within central nervous system. In other words, brain or spinal cord. Okay. Anytime we have a neuron synapsing onto any of these other types of cells, skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, glandular tissue, adipose, right? Anytime we see the existence of the neuromuscular junction or the neuroeffector junction, this is in the peripheral nervous system, which is everything else, okay? So the peripheral nervous system, and it's basically all of the neurons that are not brain or spinal cord, okay? Let me actually write this out here. Versus peripheral nervous system. Okay, so everyone understand how we can have different types of synapses, different locations, but it's essentially this functional region of communication where all of this action potential propagation that we've been speaking about. So we've been speaking about the action potential making its way down the length of our neuron like this. And so when it gets here, specifically for chemical synapses, we're going to have to convert that electrical energy to chemical energy in order for it to cross this junction. That is the main idea behind a chemical synapse, is that we don't have the gap junction, we don't have that flush communication the way that we see with an electrical synapse. And so for chemical synapses specifically, which this is an example of, we need to now convert those action potentials to some type of chemical energy to cross this junction, and then we can reconvert it to action potentials here again and propagate down the length of this neuron as well. Okay, in terms of these other types of cells, we're just going to use that chemical energy at this junction in order to excite or depolarize these cells immediately or directly, okay? All right, and we'll talk a lot more about the details of these different types of junctions coming up and the details of the events that happen here at the neuron to neuron synapse.